So, I've already done a couple of videos over the years about how I make some road cases for vintage musical instruments. And I decided to do yet another one, so a third video. The other two were done as narrated slideshows, and I decided to do this one more of a narrate as I go actual video and see how this one turns out. It's also going to be a little different from the other cases I've made in that it's smaller. I've rebuilt smaller cases and completely reworked them, putting on different hardware, improving the padding, reinforcing them, but building from scratch is something I haven't got a lot of background in on such a small case. What's the subject of this video? Is this beauty here. This is an E-flat cornet in the over-the-shoulder configuration. This dates from the American Civil War, and it's a Stratton, which is one of the leading American brands. I don't know if I can get there. John Stratton. I don't know if Stratton actually built this or if they had it built for them. There were some manufacturers who were having part of their production made by European firms to their specifications. And off the top of my head, I don't know if this one was one that Stratton themselves made or not, but it's supposedly a very good playing instrument. And it does not currently have a case, and it needs one because it's going to be graduated from being a museum display instrument to a instrument that's actually going to get used and played on a regular basis. So I'm charged with coming up with a road case for it. I've done some planning already, working out some details about what size wood I'm going to use, how I'm going to cut up the masonite panels, how much reinforcement I'm going to have, where I need to make the hinge point to have the hardware work out, how much pine boards and masonite I needed to buy at the Home Depot to make this, some elevation dimensions for the case as viewed from the front, little details about foam and how far the horn will be from the walls of the case, and then a quick study to see how long the case will be and what its depth will be, in other words front to rear. So the case is going to be 25 inches long. That's about 4 inches longer than the instrument is. It's going to be about 3 inches deeper front to back than the bell of the instrument, and it's going to be probably, let's see here, the bell is going to come about 1 inch from the bottom of the case and about the same, well, not, it won't be that high on the top because the horn is offset from the bell, but there will be something close to 1 inch of padding on the top of the case before it contacts the horn. So again, I've done my initial study. It doesn't really constitute a full design. I'm going to be winging this a little bit as I go, but at least I know the basic dimensions and configuration of the case. My first order of business was a visit to the local Home Depot, where I bought a 4x8 sheet of masonite, had them cut it in half so I can fit it in my van, and also two believe they're 8-foot long lengths of 2-inch by 2-inch select pine, which is just a straight blemish-free pine board, premium board. That's what I use for all these cases, and those fit nicely into my van with the seats removed. And then off to the Ace Hardware, where I bought all the other stuff I needed, the various fasteners, screws, bolts, adhesives, wood filler, all sorts of things like that. I've purchased my materials, and starting with the hardware I had to purchase, because this is a somewhat smaller case than I usually build, I had to downscale or downsize the hardware in some areas. So instead of the recessed latches that I usually use, I use this smaller one. It's really about the smallest kind that Reliable Hardware, and that's my supplier, uses, and it's a so-called 3-10 latch. It's their part number RH2201. RH2201. And it pivots open, and then it has the retracting hook on a spring with a spring latch butterfly type handle on it. So I have two of those, and those are about $7.36 each, so that's the most expensive piece of hardware. Then there are the keepers that the latches hook onto, and these go on the lid of the case. Of course, I have two of those, and that's the so-called number 3 keeper, RH-2327. Those are, well, those are 32 cents a piece. I misspoke before. The latches are $3.68 a piece. It was $7.36 for the both of them. So I've got my two keepers. I have 3 hinges I bought. I figured that's about right for the length of the case. I may actually only end up using 2 of them, but I wanted to get a third in case it looked like I needed one. This is the same automatic stop hinge that I usually use on my cases. And so that's a so-called small stop hinge, RH-1827. Now I usually use big, heavy, recessed, spring-loaded handles and get one on each end of the big cases and one on the top for carrying. For this small case, it doesn't need such a grandiose handle, and I just got a standard briefcase style handle. I used to buy handles like this from Ace Hardware, but the one they sell, it's a Hillman brand, or at least Hillman's the one who sells it. The handle's nice, but the metal part is really chintzy and doesn't take much stress before it breaks. This one from Reliable Hardware is much better made, and instead of being brass or something, it's steel here, so it's pretty good, I think. That's a briefcase handle, RH-0550. For the corner reinforcements or corner protectors on the case, I've got these, which already came from my existing stock. These are the smallest ones I could get my hands on, and Reliable Hardware doesn't make any this small. They really sell hardware primarily for larger road cases or heavier ones. So this is a much lighter duty, almost like a briefcase or cosmetic case style corner. But I had tons of them, and these came from Ohio Travel Bag that normally makes hardware for small cases, and I think, what do they call themselves now, Hardware Elf, something like that, their website portal for people to buy if you're not a business. Anyway, I'm pretty sure they still make these, but anyway. Anyhow, the dimensions on this, because it goes at the corner and I build my cases with a semi-monocoque structure using vertical corner posts, and I calculated I can drop it on the floor. I figured I needed a 1-inch square corner post in order to give the screws something solid to anchor in. That was a little larger than I wanted to use, but it's still okay. It's not going to really change the case dimensions. It just makes the case ever so slightly heavier, but maybe that'll come in handy. So I've got those. I usually have a case within a case, and I have a wood knob. Pick these up at Ace Hardware. They sell them in bags of 2, so I had to buy 2. I usually, with Reliable Hardware, the corners, I buy the ones that have built-in feet, and put those on the bottoms and the ones without feet on the top. Well, these smaller ones don't have built-in feet, so I just bought some of these rubber feet with screws that go with them to act as feet for the case. And for the case within a case, I got my little bag of small brass hinges I'll use for that, and various sheet metal screws of various sizes and types and lengths. All the ones I figured I would need. And it turns out that the way these latches are designed, the latch won't fold up flat if you put a screw head through the upper mounting hole. This hole right here where my thumbnail is, if I put a screw head there, then the latch won't close up. It doesn't have any clearance for a screw head in there. So even though I don't usually like to use rivets for that purpose, I had to scarf up a couple different sizes of rivets of the appropriate size. These are aluminum rivets, and the backup washers that go with them. And I have a couple of rivet guns, but they're really kind of crap, and I decided it was time to buy myself a new tool. So I got this Arrow one. It's not exactly professional quality, but it's much better than the ones I had. And for about $3 extra, I got the one with a swivel head on it, so you can have the handles in several different angles relative to where you're putting the rivet into. And it also has 4 different heads on it, or fittings for different size rivets. And the other ones I had don't have built-in storage for those. You have to keep them in a bag or something. So hopefully that'll work out well. Wood. As I always do with these cases, I got Select Pine from the Home Depot. It's not their brand. This is the so-called Claymark Select Pine, but other brands make the same thing. This is actually a product of New Zealand. It seems odd to me that they would ship pine boards all the way from New Zealand to the United States, but they do. And as usual, you have to pick these to be pretty straight. I have to go through quite a few of them to find ones that don't have a warp or a twist to them. Even though they're being Select Pine, they're not supposed to have knots or surface irregularities, and they're supposed to be pretty straight, but by the time I get to the Home Depot, unless they've just restocked, they tend to be kind of picked over. I actually had words with their lumber manager. I said, listen, you've got about 50 of these things sitting in the back. You're probably not buying new stuff because your inventory says you've got plenty, but everybody's picking those over because they've got twists and warps in them. And he's like, well, it's not my decision to make. Okay. I also need a little bit of craft plywood or aircraft plywood, so I got a much larger than I need sheet for this case in a 1/4 inch 12 by 24 inch piece. I had scraps of this around, but I figured I didn't have quite enough to build this new case, so I figured I would stock up with a new sheet of this material. And then I need some masonite, so I got a 4x8 sheet of the masonite and had it cut in half. But look at this, it's 3/16 inch. I didn't want 3/16 inch. That's much thicker and heavier than I wanted. I wanted only 1/8 inch. I'm not sure what I can even use that for. It's definitely more than I wanted. But I do have some scrap of pieces cut off of other projects. So I think I've got plenty to actually build this case, and I'll have to keep this stuff in reserve for some other project where I need it to be thicker. And there was actually a tag right on the shelf this was on that said it was 1/8 inch. I didn't have anything to measure it with. I eyeballed it and said, well, maybe that's 1/8 of an inch. I should have measured it. Anyway, so I've got everything ready here. I even realized I was out of Gorilla Glue, so I picked up a new one of those. Made sure my wood glue was still good and that my epoxy was in plenty of supply. So I'm good to go on that, but I'm feeling way too lazy to get started on this project today. So tomorrow morning, that's the nice thing about being retired, I can start projects during the day and not worry about interlacing that with a normal workday schedule. Alright, the first step is to get these pine boards, these select pines, cut down to the proper cross section. I'm going to be working with verticals in the corners that are 1 inch square, and all the other frame members are 1 inch square as well. These are 1.5 inches. And my intention is to cut off as much as I can and still leave the 1 inch. I'm planning on having a 3/8 of an inch strip along the exposed edges of the masonite for strength, and cutting that off of this 1.5 should leave about 1 inch. So what I'm going to do is set up the saw, that's my table saw, to rip a 3/8 of an inch piece or strip off of these, and that should leave me with just a hair over the required 1 inch for the rest of it. And then I'll make another pass with the fence set up to just take off that hair's extra width. It all comes down to blade width, and leave me with that 1 inch. I think that'll be more manageable than trying to cut off the 1 inch and then deal with the thinner piece of wood, cutting off a hair from that. But I think I may do a test first just to make sure that that it's going to pan out the way I wanted it to. So I've just made a test cut in a scrap board, and I'm going to measure how wide it is. And it's less than 1/8. It's about 3/32 wide. So that shows me that I can make a pass that'll take less than 1/8 of an inch off the 1.25 inch board. That'll give me my 3/8 inch and leave just a hair, maybe a 32nd of an inch of extra material that I can then take off on a subsequent pass to leave me exactly 1 inch on the remaining strip. Well, I decided that was going to be too much of a pain, so I'm just going to cut the 1 inch. That's the critical dimension, and then whatever falls off of the cut, it's going to be just a hair over 3/8 of an inch, but that's not a critical thickness, so if it's just a hair over 3/8, that doesn't bother me. I've got a set of rollers back there to help support these 8-foot long boards as they come off the table saw. Okay, I've cut the one, ripped the one, so it's 1 inch wide here, 1 inch wide, and this is the 3/8 inch piece that I've cut off. Now I have to flip this one over and make it 1 inch as well. Alright, I've got my first 1 inch square frame member. That'll get me about half of what I need for this case. So now I have to do likewise to the other 1.5 inch square piece. Alright, 4 3/8 inch strips, 2 of 1.5 inch width and 2 of about 1 inch width. Those are all useful for various things. I'll be using some of that for reinforcing strips on this case. And then I've got my 2 8-foot long, pretty straight 1x1s. Now I have to cut them to length. Both my hand shop vac and my main shop vac have pretty dirty filters, and they're not vacuuming very well, so I paused from this thrilling adventure to take my air hose out in the backyard and blow these out. Okay, I'm going to use my bevel saw to just do a trim of the end, and then I'm going to use the stop at the end to cut the long boards in quick succession, and then cut the short boards. I'm not going to show that, but that's the next step. I'm using my speed square to quickly put a perpendicular cut line on there, just to make it a little easier to sight where the saw blade's going to hit when I lower it. I do a test and bring it down. See if I can do that without everything getting in the way. Let's see, it's cutting on the left side, so that's about exactly where it should be. Okay, I've got my stop set up, so I don't have to measure each one. Now for the cutting. To get the lengths to work out along these 8-foot lengths, I take the other 2 sections off of the other 8-foot length. Makes the best use of the wood. Okay, I have my 4 long frame sections, and you may wonder why I'm using my bevel saw, or some people would call it a chop saw, but it's really not a chop saw, to do this, and that is simply that these boards are too long to cut sideways on my table saw without one of the ends of them hitting something and making it very unwieldy to do a clean job with minimum hassle. And that's exactly why I have a tool like this. As big and awkward as it is, it doesn't get used very often, but I use it when I'm making picture frames or display cases where I want bevel cuts, because it works for that much easier and better than my table saw. And I also have been using it more recently when making cross cuts on longer boards, not sheets of plywood or something like that, but just boards. It's easier and quicker and in many ways safer and more accurate. Okay, I have cut the 4 long frame rails. Those run the length of the case. I've cut the 4 front to rear frame rails. The case isn't that deep front to rear, so these are pretty short pieces. And then I've cut 4 vertical posts. That's how tall the case will be. So it's not shaping up to be a very large case, even though I initially feared that it would be. It just seemed bigger on paper. So the next thing to do is the Mortise and Tenons. So here's just a an end detail of the vertical posts, showing approximately how I'm going to do the Mortise and Tenon joints. All of the horizontal pieces have tenons, tenon tongues on them, projecting pieces, and the vertical pieces have the mortises, or the holes into which the tenons fit. The cutting of the mortises I do on my router table, and the cutting of the tenon tongues I usually do on either the table saw or the band saw. The hard part's doing the mortises. That just requires more setup and fooling around. So I'll get to that first, get the hard part done and get it out of the way. I've been using my router table for storage. I've decided to make the Mortise and Tenons 3/8 inch wide. So I have a 3/8 inch diameter straight router bit installed in my router table. And I've got a scrap piece of wood marked for 1/4 inch depth. And I'm just going to crank my top adjustment it's not engaged. I thought it was in there, but it isn't. Okay, that clicks in there. Now I can take the lock off, and I can till it comes to the requisite height. Put the lock on, remove the handle, and do a test cut. But while I'm doing this, I'm also going to try to set up the fence so I can get the mortise properly centered. And it's apparent that the fence needs to be adjusted. Okay, after enough screwing around, that's the one thing I really hate about most of these router tables, is they don't have very good fence adjustments. You usually end up with just a fence that's set into a couple of slots with a couple of thumb screws, and what I really want is something you can screw up and then just turn a crank like you would adjust maybe a fence on a table saw or something, have the whole thing move perfectly in parallel or in perpendicular alignment, so you don't have to be futzing around, because if you tighten one side then the other side moves and it's a pain in the butt. That's the only part I really hate about using the router table. Well, after doing a whole bunch of test cuts on both ends of a piece of scrap, I finally got the adjustments right, and I cut a little ways into it so that any jitter on the front end won't skew my measurement. I actually measure it further back in here, especially once it's hitting both sides of the fence cutout. That's the truest measurement. So that's finally adjusted correctly. Okay, the table's finally all set up to make these Mortise Cuts. I have a block of scrap wood C-clamped to the fence. Sometimes I just use a piece of masking tape on the table with a Sharpie line drawn on it. In this instance, I'm going to be using the block, and that's mostly because some of these pieces are pretty short. I'm going to be totally focused on holding them up to the fence on this side, and I don't want to have to be looking over here and paying attention to where the end is relative to a drawn line. I'd rather just focus over here and go up till it won't go anymore, and have my attention fully on where my hands are, really. One thing I like to do is just make a little mark at each end of the pieces that are going to get mortises. That way I don't get screwed up and cut them on the wrong side. I can either make the marks on the side I actually am going to cut, or on the side that's facing up when I make the cut. So I can make a cut like this, flip it around, make the cut, and then rotate it 90 degrees, make a cut, flip it around and make the cut, and be sure they're in the right places. Okay, let's see. Once again, I've mislaid my ear protection. Okay, I first have to turn my vacuum on, my dust collector. One thing I did to fine-tune the positioning of the mortise this way was put some little strips of post-it note, just cut off the part with the adhesive. I think I'm up to about 4 layers, and 4 layers just stuck on one on top of another, just to build up a bit of a shim. And that's a lot easier than trying to adjust this, because it always goes too far. And these are really close now to being centered. And I verify that the cut is 1 inch to the point where it starts curving. So the tenons shouldn't go past that, at least not by more than just a hair. I do a quick check to make sure that the mortises are on the correct spots. Looks okay. So I've made my first cut on the first tenon, and I'm comparing it to where the mortise is to make sure that I have the width right, that it should line up. The side of the tenon should line up with the side of the mortise when the 2 pieces of wood are in alignment. And so far that looks like it's correct. Okay, that was the shorter pieces, and now for the longer pieces, which I can't get in view. All I have is a line drawn across each piece showing how far I should cut, but as far as the position this way, that's done by the fence. And now I have to readjust the fence to cut the other slot, or to make the other cut. Okay, so they all have cuts like this at both ends. And now I just need to cut the sides off. I'm going to do one more sanity check, but I don't really think there's any adjustment that I can make at this point, and I've done several checks earlier before doing all of them. And if I line the mortise up with the tenon, even though there's a little bit of parallax here, it does line up. Try another one. Looks pretty good. Nothing that a little sanding can't cure. Okay, the fence is lined up to do these. And I'm going to use my miter pusher here to make sure I keep everything nice and square when I do those cuts. I'm going to do one cut first. Guess I should turn off the lamp. With the lamp turned off, it's a little easier to see what I'm looking at here, although that's just in the camera. With the naked eye, the lamp works better. Anyway, I want to make sure I cut those straight, so I'm using this. Okay, a test fitting. Looks like it's just right, except the tenon is just a hair too deep, so it doesn't quite close up on this side. I can fix that with just a touch of sanding, or just nip it off with the side of the table saw or something. But anyway, the alignment looks good, the width looks good, so I can proceed to do all the other ones. Instead of cutting down the tenons that were over long, which was kind of a silly thing to do, don't know what I was thinking when I said it. Instead, I'd only cut a couple of them at that point, so I just adjusted my fence to make them a little more shallower, a little bit shallower on the subsequent ones. And for that, I have to tension the fence, release the fence lock, and while maintaining tension on it, just tap it over and then lock it again. If I don't maintain tension on that, the fence always moves a little bit when I retension it by putting the lever down. So I'm basically maintaining the same tension the lever does, just a bit less of it, to keep everything locked in alignment as I'm making the small adjustments. Okay, with that said, and everything was coming out good on the couple of tests I did with the shortened tenons, so now I'm gonna resume doing those. Unfortunately, I can't show it all that well because the miter here gets in the way, but I'll still do a bit of video on it. And now for the long ones. So all those are done. End up with a bunch of little pieces. One thing I didn't do is hook up my dust removal vacuum to the saw. God, what an ugly floor here. Many years of water seepage into that spot. Okay, all of the major frame parts have all the cutting done on them. I've got my 4 verticals with the mortises in them. The 4 long horizontals with their tenons, both ends. And the 4 short horizontals with tenons on both ends. I think it's time to get lunch, and then I'll do the glue up, which then has to sit, and I can do something else for the rest of the day. They're predicting just a ton of rain sometime this afternoon, starting around 1 p.m. only about 40 minutes from now. I don't see it immediately, but apparently it's coming. But I'm starting to get some nice blossoms on my Asian, what are these, Asian lilies, I think? Except these guys in the front don't want to do anything. Anyway, so I have test fit all the frame pieces together, and this is primarily so I make sure that I haven't done something really stupid like make a case that the horn won't fit into, like that the bell will fit through it, for example, with a reasonable amount of clearance. And that when it's down inside, okay. Looks like it's just about perfect. The bottom of the horn will be about an inch off the meaning over here it'll be about an inch off the bottom, and with the bell more or less level, the top will be, meaning this point right here, yeah, that's just about right. And the cut line or the hinge line of the case will be about here. So the top part of the horn will be sticking out of the case when the lid is open, which is good. So I've got my tabletop covered in wax paper. I've got 2 picture frame type band clamps staged and ready to go, and a pair of nitrile gloves because the Gorilla Glue can stain and get all over things, and a dish of water and a little brush, basically a flux brush, so I can apply water to the wood before I start gluing it. And it needs to come together pretty quickly, so I won't show that, but I will show the aftermath of it. I also have 3 randomly selected 90-degree angles so I can check the squareness of the frame after gluing, so I can adjust it before the glue starts to set up. Alright, I've got the band clamps in position and tightened up. I'm checking the angles. And I just have a square piece of plywood for the other angle. So it all looks like it's pretty much true. And now I just have to let this sit overnight. The Gorilla Glue is already starting to foam, which is a good sign. It's supposed to do that. It says it's having its necessary chemical reaction. It will completely fill the gap and then solidify. The mortises were slightly too long, so on the bottom of the case, just gravity holds the frame pieces down. They could have actually come a little bit further up in the mortise slots, but because of gravity they're down. But when I put the top frame on, of course, they settled very slightly, very consistently all the way around. And that's fine. It's not a critical dimension. I'll just lop those off once the glue dries. So this is the basic frame construction, and it'll be quite strong by itself. And then when I inlay the masonite, that's the other part of the semi-monocoque structure that this case will have. So the thing about semi-monocoque means that the strength is primarily in the skin, but with assistance of a light framework. So airplane fuselages are made semi-monocoque. They have a light stringer frame, and then most of the strength is actually in the skin itself, but the skin attaches to the light framework. So they both reinforce each other while being extremely strong for the amount of weight and space they take up. So this case here, once it's done, I could jump up and down on it, run into it with a car, things like that, and it would hold up pretty well. So there's absolutely nothing else to do on it now except for waiting for the Gorilla Glue to set up thoroughly. Okay, next morning, the frame is all ready to go. I need to trim the excess from the corner posts, and I need to take the chisel to the foam out on the glue. Most places I could leave it, it's just I prefer it to be a little neater. So I've got a randomly selected chisel here. I'm going to go and start chopping away at that excess foam right now, using my Japanese pull saw to trim off the excess on those posts. I just hold the blade lightly against both this surface and this surface. The design of the teeth has very little kerf on it, so it won't really chew into the side wood, and that just keeps it so it'll be cutting nice and flat. And it's a pull saw, so it cuts on the pull. I've got the small tooth saw going here so it doesn't cut too aggressively, so it does require a lot of pulls, but I'm not moving the saw that much, so it's only moving a couple of inches per stroke. Once I get near the end, I don't want to cut into my table saw top. I start going down at a bit of an angle this way. Just going very carefully here. So that's nice and smooth there now. This one will be a little easier because it's laying flat, it won't move around so much. So the next step is to get the inlays going. And what I do is, for this semi-monocoque structure, I use a router to route out a little bit of the depth, but not all the way to the edge. I'm thinking I'll figure it out, but a lot of it will be based on the coverage of these corners. Things are like trying to hold on to bars of soap. So it's about like this, so the corner itself will only cover up maybe about 1/3 the width of the wood. And I usually let these covers, these corner reinforcements, hide the gap in the wood where the corners of the inlay and the corners of the route come together, so it's less apparent. So yeah, really I need to bring the inlay a bit closer to the outside for that to be hidden. On the bigger cases, I would have a much larger corner reinforcement that would cover up this whole area, so you wouldn't even see it. It would just be covered up by metal. On this one, it's going to be a little visible, but with the sanding and the painting and so on, I don't think it'll be that bad. Plus, these cases get beat up anyhow in normal use, and it's not like they're going to look pristine forever, but I still like to do a good job. So this is where I have to do my inlay to for the best results. That way the inlay will cover up the tenons entirely, and the only part that'll be exposed is this little joint here and this joint here. That won't be covered up by the metal corner reinforcing piece. So I just need to get my router out and get everything set up to do that. Well, I'd mentioned how I'd accidentally bought some thicker than anticipated. I believe it was 3/16 inch masonite that is really too heavy for a case of this size. I have some left over, whatever thickness this is. I want to say it's 1/8 of an inch, but let's see. Yeah, 1/8 of an inch. Masonite left over from another case. And I think it'll have enough area on it to do this. So because of the inlays, they're always smaller than the XY dimensions of any case side. So what I usually like to do here is I just mark out where the case goes and make one mark, another mark, just enough. So if I cut along these marks, the pieces will be approximately the size of the XY dimensions, but it actually needs to be a bit smaller than that to fit into the inlay, and that's fine. That gives me just a little bit of waste around the edges that I can cut away later on. So I'm going to mark this piece of masonite up for the cutting. It always turns on at the least opportune moment when I'm trying to narrate something. Anyway, you think that's loud. You should have seen the old pancake compressor I had in here. That would wake you up in the middle of the night. This, at least, while it's noisy down here, it's just a dull murmur upstairs. Anyway, so I've got the various 6 pieces marked off here. The cuts don't need to be precise. It's just to get it into manageable sections. Even though masonite isn't going to hurt you too much by the pieces it throws out, because they're pretty soft. I always wear my table saw face mask when working on this stuff, and then I vacuum up right away because it does make a lot of very fine powdery dust that just sticks to everything, and I prefer to get it cleaned up before I track it around. Okay, so just doing a bit of a sanity check here, making sure that I did cut them to the full size I wanted. That one looks good. And rolling it over. Looks good. Okay. So now for the inlaying process. I'm going to use my smaller router for this. This is a nice manageable size. The inlay line I've determined is 1/4 inch from the outer edge. That's on a 1 inch wide piece, so it requires 3/4 of an inch to remove. I want to do it in one pass for tidiness and consistency, so I have a 3/4 inch wide straight bit that I'm going to put in my router. I'm going to set up the fence to go along and keep it at the right distance from the edge. I'm going to make sure I set the depth so that it takes out just a hair more than the thickness of the masonite, so that the masonite sits ever so shallow of the surface here. Then when I sand it, I can take it down to the level of the masonite very easily. Okay, I'm ready to do my first test cut. I have the router fence set up so the edge of the bit is right on the cut line, and I've got the router so that it's approximately 1/8 of an inch, as near as I could adjust it. The downside to this particular router is it has no fine adjust for vertical. I may have to revert to my bigger router, which does have that, if this turns out to be insufficient, but for such a small case I hate using that monster on it if I don't need to. So I'm going to start with a plunge and just do a little cut, and then see I have a test piece of wood here that when I've cut enough of it, I can go in and lay it in there and see if it lays in at the correct depth. Okay, there's the initial test. So let's see how that fits in there. Boy, that's just about perfect. It's just a couple sheets of paper deeper than the masonite is. I think everything's set up good. I'm just going to keep cutting. One thing I do need to do here is make my end of cut line so when I get to the end there, I can see where I'm supposed to stop. Get wood chips everywhere with this stuff. So I'm doing a couple more sanity checks. Make sure nothing's drifted. Everything's still looking good. So I'm going to proceed with the other parts of the side here. Okay, so I've routed out the inlay area for one side and just do spot checks. Make sure the depth didn't drift. There are a few gotchas. You can see one here. That's where I just probably was changing my stance or something and allowed the router to stray a little bit. Yeah, you know, if the fence doesn't stay up against the material, it cuts out, but that's not a big deal. That I always fill the gap anyway with epoxy wood filler, and that's just a little bigger area to fill. It's pretty insignificant, but it is important to always try to keep control of where the router is, and that's exactly why I clamp it down to the table, because otherwise it just shifts around way too much and becomes very difficult to do a neat job. Alright, I've done 3 sides, not the end pieces yet, but I've done 3 sides, so I'm going to show the routing of this last section. Sanity check. Everything looks good. No shortage of wood chips made. Okay, I did the end pieces just sitting it on the floor. I don't like doing it that way. I put my foot across to stabilize it. That holds it pretty steady. I just have to be very careful. So I've got the inlay at each end, and on all 4 sides. So inlay cutting is done. At this point there's always a little bit of flash, which I'm going to clean up with a utility knife and or a chisel, whichever does the job best. Now for putting in the inlays, every side is slightly different. Nothing is completely square. The dimensions are always a little different, so each one is cut to fit. So I've marked A, B, C, and D, and then going up to the end I have E and F on the other side. So I'm going to start with A, and this is a narrow side. I go to my collection of pre-cut pieces, and here is a narrow pre-cut, and obviously it needs to be cut down. So the first thing I have to do is start with one corner, and I have to lop off about that much of a corner. I'll just do that quickly on the table saw. Okay, so let's see if that side is square. what I do is I take the long edge and I try to lay it right like this, and it looks like it's pretty square. I don't have to trim this much. So what I do is I work on the long side first. Now that I know the right side lines up along with the long side here, I can pull this piece back slightly and just make sure that it's still firmly lined up over here. And I come over here and I make a mark on the masonite right here. Where I cross the inlay line. Then I push the inlay back towards the rear, and once again I make a mark where it crosses the inlay line. Now I just take my straight edge and I have a cut line, so I'm now going to use my table saw to cut along that line. And I have to take off the corner here. So now that should fit in here. I've got it pressed into the inlay. It's up against the edge and it fits over here. So now I have to make marks left and right by shifting the inlay a bit to the left and making a mark here, and moving it to the right and making a mark here, and then getting my straight edge out and marking between those marks. Drawing a line between those marks, I should have said. And I'm going to do a sanity check here and just make sure that I marked it in the right place. Looks good. So now I just have to cut that on the table saw. And I almost forgot to do a critical step. At the very beginning of this, I should have marked this A, so I don't lose orientation. But once I make the final cut here, it's easy to forget which way it goes. Alright, will it go in? Well, it's just a hair tight. I have to go and just shave a little bit off the edge there. Okay, it goes in Pretty good fit. So that's the A section cut to fit. Move on to the B section. Do the same thing. And there's the B section. The masonite's a little warped. It doesn't want to sit down. The glue will take care of that, but it is fitting. Moving on to the C section. And C section, looking good. And D. And section E. One more to go. And section F. That actually is a very quick job. It seems like it should be one of the more difficult parts, but it's actually pretty straightforward and doesn't take very long. So, next up is the gluing. I need to have a few beam clamps. I usually use longer ones, but I have a smaller collection of these shorter ones. And I think that's a good thing because this case weighs so little so far. The frame part of it weighs so little. If I have much more than a little bit of offset, and these aren't exactly lightweight, they could tip the whole thing over. So what I'm going to do here is do opposing sides. So I'll put in A and C attached with Gorilla Glue, and then I'll clamp them. Alright, I figure I need to have 4 per side, and that's 4 here, 4 down here, and then 1 here, and 1 here. And luckily I have that many, so I'm going to get them all set to about the right length, and then I'll start the gluing process. Okay, nitrile gloves. Don't want to be using bear skin around the Gorilla Glue. It's not like Elmer's glue or something. It's on there and it'll stain and it'll stick. And you definitely don't want to get it on any good clothes because it will not wash out. As it says on the bottle, will ruin clothes. So, okay, so I've got the A side up. And you need to be pretty quick about this because the Gorilla Glue activates on moisture. So I need to paint surface with one of the surfaces with moisture. I usually do the masonite side because it's easier to see where I need to put the glue if I put the glue in the inlay cutout area. So the first thing I do is get section A ready. Now this I'll have section C at the ready. So now I'm going to paint this with water real quickly, and it'll make the masonite expand. So actually, I'm forgetting a step here. The thing to do is put the glue down first, then hit the masonite with the water, then stick it together before the masonite swells. So I put a bead of Gorilla Glue right along the center of the inlay, maybe a little bit towards the ridge. I don't want to overdo it here, but I also don't want to leave too little glue anywhere. If I had a handy spray bottle, I could use that too, but I don't. Okay. Okay, I immediately flip this upside down and do likewise to the other side. Water treatment. Okay. I turn this sideways now like this. Okay, so the first two panels are being attached. I don't make the clamps very tight because with all of those squeezing I can actually bow the frame. I don't really want to do that. It's going to bow a little bit due to the pretty mild clamping pressure, and it'll spring back from that. Anyway, so the goal here is just to make sure that the masonite doesn't warp out of the frame at any point. Not too happy with that one. I think I'm going to readjust that guy. Now, I can't really do anything else on this today. It recommends at least 2 hours of clamping before releasing the clamps. I'm probably going to clamp up another 2 sides early this evening. It's about 1 o'clock now. It's time for lunch. But probably, I don't know, 4 o'clock this afternoon or something. 5 o'clock, I'll remove these clamps and then do the next 2 sides. Okay, the foamed out glue is pretty solid, so I think it's safe to take the clamps off and do the next 2 sides. I usually try to clean up the foamed out Gorilla Glue. I really overdid it here. I don't usually put on quite as heavy a bead, or I put on the amount of bead that I'm used to for the bigger cases, and for this one there's less area for the glue to go, so it was probably overkill. But it's hard to modulate out a smaller bead than that, really, so I don't think it hurts anything. It's just you have more foam out to clear up, and the chisel makes pretty short work of this. Okay, once again, I'm donning the nitrile gloves. I'm going to do a test fit of these 2 panels, B and D, just to make sure that nothing has gone off of the fit due to putting in the other pieces. Sometimes that happens. Yep. Let's see. Now it's a little bit too tight along there. I have to trim that a little bit. Okay, that one's good. Yep, that comes from the clamps. It just subtly changes the alignments. Tiny amount. Now. This side is still bowed in ever so slightly. Doesn't want to drop in there. Yeah, it'll work. Alright, so now we have to wait for that one to go. It's about 5:30. Probably about the time I'm ready to go to bed, I can come down here and put on the remaining two pieces at the ends of the case. Then tomorrow I can do the preliminary sanding and primer painting, after which the case will get cut into the main and the lid parts, and then I can start mounting hardware and reinforcing wood strips and things like that. Well, actually I don't mount the hardware until I've done the finish coat, but I'm using that acrylic lacquer and it dries very quickly, so we don't have to wait a real long time between coats. Alright, the glue is pretty hard, so I'm going to take the clamps off. Okay, that all came out pretty well. I've chiseled it to get the expanded foam stuff out of the edges. There's still some cleanup work to be done on the inside, but that'll come after we cut the case apart later on. So now I have to do the end panels. Checking my fit. That one's still good. That one's still good. And I just tape that panel so I can flip it over and do the other one. Alright. I've got this one clamped with a different set of clamps. These are longer beam clamps. Still the cheapo Chinese-made economy model, but they are doing what they need to do. So tomorrow morning when I get down here, I'm going to use my epoxy wood filler on all the gaps, on all the seams, and then let that cure, and then give the whole thing a rough sanding, a fine sanding, and then start putting the primer coats on. And I believe the way I'm going to do this one is once the primer coats are on, I'm going to cut it in half, or cut it into two pieces anyhow, and they probably won't put the finish coats on until it's been cut. Taking a look at my belt sander. This is my larger handheld belt sander. I have a smaller one too, as well as a couple of bench mount ones, but this is the one I usually use for rough sanding, just to bring wood down to a level. And it's got a lot of glop on it from the last few times it's been used, so I think I'm going to fire it up and try using my gummy block here, whatever these things are properly called, to see if I can get some of that off the belt. Well, it helped a little bit, but it still has a lot of crap on it. It'll work though, it'll be fine. Okay, so the other consideration with how tall the case lid needs to be from the hinge line, or the cut the box into parts line, if you will, is the dimension of the hinge. So here I've got the hinge, and I've got its pivot or its axle right on the hinge line on the drawing, and it looks like it needs to be at least 1 5/8 inches. Now if I just make it 2 inches, then the top of the case will be here. So just to visualize it here, There's the top of the case, and there's the thickness of the masonite on the top panel. Here's how much clearance there's going to be, about 1/4 of an inch between the top of the hinge plate and the inside top of the case. That's pretty good. I don't really want it to go right up to the edge. I'd like the hinge to be a little bit shy of the edge. It just looks better. And as I determined before, I think that much height out of the overall height of the box, and 4 3/8 inches up from the point where the bell's going to sit. So I need to recheck that dimension, because the case top can be more than 4 inches or more than 2 inches. It's just that I think 2 inches is the minimum. Alright, so I have a bit of a sketch up here to scale. I'm identifying the bottom of the case. I have a line for the 1/8 inch bottom masonite. In parts, I'm going to have a 1/4 inch craft plywood reinforcing strip, so I put that in there. Then I'm going to have 3/4 inch thick foam to rest the bottom of the bell on, and that'll satisfy my at least 1 inch from any part of the horn to the outside of the case criteria that I usually follow. It's one of the several things that I always try to build into the case design. Then I have at right angles to the bottom of the case a line that I want the bell rim to sit on. So I get the bell positioned that way. So the horn is positioned there. And now I take a measurement to see where the top of the bell rim is going to be. So I got the bell rim marked. This dictates where the rest of the horn is going to lay in the case. And accounting for parallax, I'm about 7/8 of an inch from the top highest key to the edge of the case, so approximately 1 inch. And I may fudge it slightly. I may set the blocking up to lower this just a hair. It'll still be approximately flat here. Anyway, so that is a good verification of how deep things need to be. And now I have to justify this with where I want to have the case break regarding the rest of this. So I could have it break right at the top of the bell rim. That's a pretty substantial part of the case that's going to flop open, and that's okay. Let me extend that line over so I can visualize it better over here. So here's the top of the bell rim line, and here's just a rough outline of the horn in this area. Actually, I should use my more visible ruler. So that's about 3.5 inches and change. If I make the minimum hinge line, which would be 2 inches down from the top, the only thing that'll be sticking out the top will be the keys and the top of the lead pipe. I would like to give it a bit of a easier grasp because the case is pretty narrow front to rear, just a little easier to grab the horn and lift it out. So I think that's going to force me into, or encourage me at least, to making the case top 3 inches rather than 2 inches. Right there. So the hinge line of the case will be about 1/2 inch above where the bell rim is, and that's pretty reasonable, I think. The player will be able to grab the horn right about here, free of the top of the case, and yet the case won't be completely lopsided as far as the top and the bottom goes. So that's made my decision. The case is going to be 3 inches deep on the case lid. Okay, I've got the fence on my table saw set up to 3 inches from the inside of the blade, and I've got the blade set to more than 1 inch. And why is that when the thickness is only 1/8 of an inch? It's because I have those 1 inch frame pieces in there, and the saw blade needs to be high enough up to get through those. I made that mistake the first time I built one of these cases. How come the case isn't coming apart? I've cut it all the way around. Oh, the frame. Since the video snippet I originally recorded didn't work out, I want to just say a couple words about the paint. I'm using a Krylon product, their series called Acrylic. It's a set of acrylic paints and lacquers, or enamels and lacquers. I think it's primarily the lacquer, but the primer, of which I'm showing the label here, and it shows the Krylon part number, that's actually an acrylic enamel, but then the color paints are acrylic lacquers, and I'll show the label information on that when I get to that stage. Okay, I've cut the case on the front and rear, and now I have to tip it up on end and cut the ends. Okay, case has been cut in half. And before I lose orientation, I need to make some alignment marks inside and outside, primarily inside. That'll help a lot. So I've marked left front here and here, and I just made an additional mark at the right front. So a couple things have to happen now. One is I managed to chip out a little bit of the case somewhere. Yeah, here. This got caught. I need to put that back on and glue it down. A little bit of epoxy and fill that extra space there. I think the bottom of the case came through unscathed in that regard. I want to clean up the edges just a little bit, and I need to get in there with the chisel and chisel out the foam. It's my first opportunity to do that. Then I'm going to glue on the reinforcing strips on the long edges, at least, top and bottom. And let's see, then I have to start concentrating on where I'm going to put the hinges and the latches, and glue on reinforcing plates of plywood or pine strips to take the screws. So that's the next step. Okay, I'm mixing up a little epoxy to put this chipped out piece of wood on the corner. Okay, I've epoxied in there. I put the wood chip back in. I put a piece of wax paper over it and then taped over it to hold it down firmly. I also put in a little epoxy fill where another piece of wood chipped out and I couldn't find it. There's still going to be a little bit of fill up here in the corner. I'll probably use some of that 2-part wood fill for that. Not sure yet. Might just make epoxy to do it. But this piece needs to cure up first. I'll give that a few minutes and then attack the rest of the fill. Alright, I decided to do the extra fill with just regular epoxy instead of the wood putty. So now that this part is reasonably set, I put a piece of masking tape up along the right edge to form a barrier so the new epoxy wouldn't just run out there. And then I just filled this area here with epoxy up above the surface. And once that sets, I'll give it about 10 minutes, then I'll flip this up and do the same thing for this area. Then it should be good to go. I've already established that I need to have a 1-inch support area for the valences due to the width of those valences. So again, they take just a hair less than 1 inch. So I need a 1-inch valence to support it. Or valence support strip to support it. Okay, to verify the valence support strip, that's 3/8 of an inch thick. And then I've traced out the female and male strip dimensions, although this is slightly large because I traced outside the lines. This is a 3/4 inch long screw, and it'll go into the valence support strip by about that much, which is plenty. There will be several of these, and that's enough to hold it on. And then for the male one, it has a much longer overhanging strip, and I'm just going to go through the shallow flange, and the screw is going to possibly poke slightly through the valence support strip into the masonite, but that's fine, it's coming in from the rear. The reason on the female that I go through the thicker part is because there's not enough of the extending flange here to get through with the head of the screw and not have it be right on the hairy edge. Plus then it's supporting it from the very edge of the valence instead of closer to the middle where it should be. With these I can go in about here and I think it'll be fine, but these guys I have to go through right about here. So anyway, that's mostly just to confirm that the 3/8 inch strip that I've already cut is the right dimension. Alright, I have 4 valence supporting strips, 3/8 of an inch thick and 1 inch wide, and then 4 non-valence supporting strips. They're just reinforcing strips for the edge of the wood, just like this. Make it so it's not just that thin exposed piece of masonite along these edges. And I think I'm going to use epoxy for this, but I have been using this brand, JB Weld, 2-part epoxy and the 5-minute epoxy. I used to use, I think it was DevCon, but the Ace Hardware I go to stopped carrying it, replaced it with the JB Weld. I guess somebody bought them off. Their rep paid a bigger dividend or something. I don't know how they figure out which brand to carry. But I never had any problem with the DevCon stuff. And this stuff I found to be very particular. It seems like it has a narrower range of temperatures that it'll set up properly in, and it's sensitive to humidity. I'd called them and said, hey, I'm having a lot of problems with this product. And they were just like, well, it's very sensitive to different environmental conditions. I thought I never had that problem with the other stuff. I don't know what the difference is, but so I decided to just try. They still carry the DevCon at the store, but only in these bottles, which are expensive. And as soon as you open them up, they're shot, so you have to use them right away. I think I'm going to try those out and see how it works for gluing these guys up. Okay, all the reinforcing strips are epoxied using various spring clamps and small beam clamps. So I've made markings on the valence strips for where the screw holes have to go. And typically what's happening here is the holes are about centered across this span here. The part inside, not the part outside, so roughly 1/8 of an inch from the back here over. And I typically put the screw holes about every 6 inches. It works out to put 5 screws in at every 5 7/16 inch, so even better than every 6 inches. Alright, so the valence strips all have their holes drilled, and I've got one of the 3/4 inch sheet metal screws going through. There's about 1/4 of an inch sticking out to go into the valence support wood strip. But I'm not going to try screwing them on yet. I want to give the epoxy more time to cure. But already it's apparent that this stuff is setting up a lot better than that JB Weld epoxy I was using. Now I actually have a gig to go play, so I can't work on this anymore today.